Today we're heading off to Peterborough, a once bustling railway town that sits on the edge of the Flinders Ranges in mid-north South Australia. This historic regional town sits approximately 250 kilometres from the state's capital of Adelaide. It's late afternoon and a Pacific National Steel train heads back to the historic mining town of Broken Hill in New South Wales. The train is passing through Peterborough's iconic railway station with its extra long platform. In its heyday, Australia's famous transcontinental train, the Indian Pacific, would stop at Peterborough to drop off and pick up passengers. But these days, they only get a glimpse of the station from their air-conditioned cabins. The town of Peterborough, like many once bustling railroad towns, has an interesting history, and its rise and fall of a railway town is far too complicated and interesting for this video. One thing that Peterborough shows us with amazing clarity is that you should never let state governments design and build their own railways. In the 1800s, Australian governments were run by Irish, Scottish and British men. And of course, there's thousands of years of rivalry between them, so they didn't want their trains running on each other's railroads. So that's why Australia ended up with 3 different gauges. As population grew and the country expanded, it was inevitable that the 3 different gauges would soon collide. And that's what happened in Peterborough. And here is one of the world's only tri-gauge, that's right, tri-gauge turntables. You can only imagine how much extra work was involved in keeping this yard running. Every turnout and crossing in the yard is a mix of either standard and narrow gauge, or standard and broad gauge, or broad gauge and narrow gauge. And this is one of the reasons why Australia's railways is 100 years behind. The Steamtown Heritage Rail Museum does a great job of explaining the history of the rail in Peterborough. And it's worth a visit if you're ever in town. I'll certainly be returning to this fascinating and interesting town in South Australia, so stay tuned. This Adelaide-bound Bowman's rail train is carrying mineral sands from the mining town of Broken Hill. It's a windy morning as an eastbound Indian Pacific makes its way towards Sydney. This train started its journey in Perth in Western Australia and will continue through to the east coast of Sydney. It crossed the Nullarbor Plain and travelled along the longest straight section of railroad track in the world, over 400 kilometres, dead straight. The train rounds the curve and heads into the remoteness of Australia's outback. Its next stop is Broken Hill, Australia's iconic mining town, and the place where they filmed Mad Max.